Thank you very much, Susan, for the introduction, and thank you for having me here today. I'd like to just start and say I'm actually not a computer scientist anymore. Well, I say that. I was trained as a computer scientist, but then I ventured along the path of the guinea pig path, actually, because I was the first one, for web science in Southampton. And I did a master's in web science, and was training under Susan and Catherine Pope, who can be here today, and Leslie Carr, professors at Southampton University, and did my PhD half social science, half computer science, and was looking at how you integrate social theory with the computational models that we use in computer science. So that's a bit of background to me. So what I want to do today is just talk to you, as Susan nicely introduced, all about the work that we're doing in terms of trying to understand big data and trying to understand how we can interrogate big data from a sociological lens rather than just from the computational perspective, which is, you'll hear about a little bit, which is slightly naive. That's going to kill me, isn't it, the camera, by saying that. So, as we say, big data is not new. There's warehouse data. Tesco has lots of data about us. I mean, in the 80s, there's big warehouses and big mainframes collecting lots and lots of data. But we're trying to frame this big data in terms of the social data that's out there now on the web. And as Susan said, there's billions of pages being on the web. Lots of that data is freely available in certain circumstances. And now with the rise of the social web, the web 2.0, let's say, there's lots of social data being produced. And lots of that data is in real time. And lots of that data is all about human activity, human interaction, human communication. And it's potentially interesting for us. And as I say there, it's exciting. Why? Because it's telling us about human interaction at scale. We're actually, from looking at those small surveys to something that's large and looking at people interacting across a global scale. So, but the actual engagement with this data is obviously limited by the way we have methods to interrogate it. And I just want to take the paper that we looked at is looking at Twitter, for example. But we don't want to just limit our sort of understanding on one platform. We want to try and take this broader, so Facebook, YouTube, Pinterest, whatever it might be, these social services, and then stepping at an abstract layer above that is social interaction on the web, not just within a platform, but that's something a little bit later I'll talk about. And we're talking about Twitter, so it started in 2006, but until about 2009 is when it got popular, when people started engaging it with various different devices, from mobile phones. GPS signal on the actual phone became popular. You had Wi-Fi enabled in different buildings, so you start seeing this mass effect, and there's a nice graph that colleagues in Southampton show of how the web kind of grew, and around 2009 you start seeing the technologies coalescing together, and you start seeing the social web really being enacted. But there are methodological challenges. So if you have a look at the paper and you look at some of the literature we reviewed, if we step firstly in the computer science literature, we're very much biased towards the methods we use. So we're very positivistic. We look at, we categorize data in terms of using traditional old techniques which were applied to data sets which we could derive behavioral interactions, which typically something like a power grid data set. If you have power grid data sets on the national grid, it's very easy to say, well, we know switch 1 is going to affect switch 2, so we can do predictive models on that and say, if switch 2 goes off, then likelihood switch 1 is going to go off. But human interaction is slightly different from that, as we all know. I don't preach into the convert here, I don't know why I'm saying this, but just to say that, if this was in computer science, actually, no. But honestly, we apply these old methods and we try and put them in place of these new types of data, and predictive modelling is very difficult to use in this circumstances, and we see lots of literature trying to do this. Again, from the social science, it's we're faced with a billion tweets, for instance, or a billion items. How do you deal with this? You can't sit down and get 10 PhD students to go through, 100 million each. It's a bit impossible, although I think in Oxford someone tried. So it's very difficult to apply these methods and trying to understand what these methods are actually trying to use and how they affect the data. So what I want to do is in this presentation is talk to you a little about the tool that we developed and show you some of what it is. It's a piece of software, but it's more than that because it's our kind of platform or our tool to interrogate the data. And it's a way we can look at it from various different perspectives, and I've talked about that. And then I want to go through the example that we used in the paper, which is about a student protest in 2011, and just highlight how this tool was allowing us to interrogate the data. And then finally, just finish off with a few final thoughts about this kind of interdisciplinary approach. So, the basic principles that led us to where we are. So I studied with Susan and looked at using actor network theory to interrogate how online communities emerge. And from this, there was a strong the kind of directive about how roles emerge from how interaction occur between a network, and how the actual outcomes of a network is based on the interactions on that. So we took these principles, basic principles, and started to look at information, real-time information, and how networks grew within a social network, and how, based on these networks and these interactions, different roles started to emerge. So the first principle that we took is begin with the whole network. So one of the things that we notice in many of these studies is that you begin with a very small sampled scale of the network. So you might have 1 billion tweets, and you reduce it straight away down to 1,000. And practically, we understand why you do that, because it's very difficult to compute or to actually do any, say if you're doing qualitative analysis, it's very difficult. But the problem is it reduces the network, the actual dynamics of the network, to something that's already being sampled. The second thing we looked at is how do we capture the flow of information. And these are ideas, like I said, the emergence of a network, but another kind of principle that led this is in computer sciences and information sciences. You look at information cascades, and you might have heard this idea of memes, how memes spread on the web, and people use these ideas of cascade models to track how information flows over time. But typically the computer science approach to this is, what the idea is, you get a big data set, you split it up and you say, I know how information is going to spread because you can see it, and then you build a model and say, I'm going to predict how information spreads. And we weren't interested in the prediction, we just want to know, we want to understand how information spreads and use that model of how information emerges and connects to each other, so how one person talks to another person, let's say, in Twitter for instance, and use that as an approach to understand how these networks grow. And the third thing, which I think we really tried to push, is the idea of wide data, or working between the micro and the macro. So being able to transition from looking at the entire network, so from step 1, step 2, to looking at individual pieces, or individual actors or roles, or pieces of entities, whatever it might be within the network. So we apply this to Twitter and we see it's actually messages, okay? So yeah, Flow 142 was derived from that. And as I say, it's these different principles that allowed us to actually develop. So one thing I want to talk about here is actually how we develop a model of different user roles. And before I make a caveat on that, these user roles are not predefined. We're not saying, here's a network and we pre-select users within a network, okay? So the whole intention of Flow 140 is to allow networks to grow, so allow conversations to happen, so you might be monitoring, and I just add to that, we look at real-time and historic data. Is to look at how networks grow over time, and based on the place where they are, so based on what communications were happening within that network, and how people are interacting, these user roles actually emerge from it. And we name them, as you see at the bottom, idea starter, aggregator, amplifier, commentator, but these are just names for us to identify them and to visually inspect the data. But we're not placing a sort of a prefixing on the actual data itself. We want those roles to emerge. So, for instance, in one network, user A might exhibit a certain characteristic within their communications to allow them to fall into that category. But in another network, they might do something else. So that's the intention. And what does that mean? Sort of a bit of a visual explanation of this is that it's a little bit hard to see. Sorry, I think it's the resolution. But at the very beginning, you have this kind of idea of the idea starter. So this is where like I said, these are just names that we use to visually inspect it. And then as the information spreads, as the information goes, it's like a cascade. At different points within the information spreading, they emerge to be different roles. So as we say here, amplifier is someone that's the first person to engage with this piece of information on the network, and they spread it to a larger community of individuals. So, for instance, someone like an aggregator, for instance, would be someone that's, again, the first person to identify this information. But what we found over time, when this model was also developed, I'd just like to say, as an iterative process. It wasn't something that we came up, we were inspecting many different data sets to see what actually happens, and we just use these names to label them, is when you see tweets, for instance, or two different information cascades merged together. So someone might be talking about hashtag A, someone might be talking about hashtag B. And the aggregator will bring these two pieces of information together, but they're the first person to be able to do that. So they're kind of early spotters of the, let's say if it's in terms of Twitter, of the news, and then they aggregate, but they spread it out to a larger community. So that's the basic underlying principle for this. And as I said there, you can mine in real time. We look at the diffusion of the networks, and we want to understand structure and the micro-macro. So what does this actually look like? So I'm going to show you some videos of the student process as well, but I just thought I'd give you a quick overview of what we actually have as a tool that we use. And we map the network, we allow the network to grow, and this is just an illustration of the network, but what we want to actually see is how information passes between people. So each of these dots, the nodes, let's say, represents a person, and the lines between them represents communications that have happened between two different people. And as you probably saw when I click forward, when you actually click on an edge, you can see where information came from and who it was shared to in that kind of sense. So what's the pathway? And if we look at it in more detail, this is kind of showing the transition between understanding as a network and understanding as information flow. So this represents how quickly something emerged and the content that happened within that, and the people that were actually responsible for that. The second example is trying to understand how at the larger scale, how the entire network grew. So we can see over time the network grows. It actually happened in real time, you'll see in the video. And then we can interrogate the chains of information, so the actual cascade that happened, and see it in time. And then we can look at, for instance, we click on an item and we can see the entire network as a whole. So even though we're only seeing a partial view of the network, once we find something that's interesting, we're allowed to look at the entire network. And finally, it's this idea of transitioning between the micro and the macro. Is we're interested in an individual, what they're saying, we can find out their data, and we can look a little bit more about what information is being said. And this was just to follow on from Susan's slide. This was Tim Berners-Lee in 2011 talking about when they had a conference in Hyderabad, and it was just all about the tweets. And if you look at the data set about him, it's all about Tim Berners-Lee, but there's something else. And the final thing I just wanted to add to this is the idea of looking at data in real time and trying to understand it in terms of where data is coming from, in terms of geographic perspective as well as communications. And we're able to map in real time where data is coming from on these communication channels, look into more detail, find the types of information and who they are and what type of time frames they're going in. So, onto the actual study itself. So what we looked at, we wanted to see what this method that we've been developing and what this kind of approach to taking large data sets and looking at them as a whole could provide for us in terms of looking at a specific subject. So we took the November 9th student protest in 2011 and we captured in real time just under 13,000 tweets by under 5,000 people. And just kind of, you'll see in a minute, but the basic analysis of 67% of that were retweets, so 60% were actually people reposting someone else's messages, whereas only 11%, so just a tenth of it, basically a tenth, was actual direct communications between people. And we see this is a typical, if you take many different data sets, which we've done, this is a typical kind of structure in a network. Much fewer direct communications to actual sharing, so there's lots of information actually being passed between people. One of the things I'd like to highlight, and this is really important that I think Susan's talking about this afternoon on the panel on ethics, so everyone go to that, but is the practice that we took in this. And at the time when we were doing this, we were looking around and many of the papers just produced the data. They just pumped out, okay, here's user X, Y, and Z, their real names, Here's what they said at what time, and with all the correct information within the actual data. And we took the position that this is probably not the good idea to do, because in the next year's time, how do we know what that information might contain? Is it, from an ethical perspective, we felt that this wasn't the right practice to do. So in terms of doing all of this, we anonymized every single tweet in there. All the usernames have been changed. All the URLs have been changed, so you can't click on it. If you were to click on the link, it wouldn't take you to the actual data source. And various different things were changed on there. So the data is also freely available on the Web Observatory, which is a project we have in Southampton, which is the platform where you can take the data and use it for your own use. But all of the data within there, all the items, all the entities have been changed. So we just want to make a point on that. So what was the intention of this? So going back to what the tool does, we wanted to understand what does the actual data reveal. If we take this approach, what can it show us in terms of the network that grows, the user roles that emerge, and the content that's produced? And as I say, and what happens over time, and we'll see some interesting things actually, how the roles emerge and how some roles stay the same. And the intention is we wanted to do it without reducing the graph down. We wanted to take the entire network. So in terms of just a quick overview of what the data look like, we can see November 9th, huge spike in activity. And just to say, the November 9th protest was on the ground, so there were people tweeting around about this. So it was a huge online and offline demonstration, as we'll find out in the content of the information. Lots of it, like I say, is retweets, only a tenth of it is actual mentions. And this is a network of it if you didn't use any of the classifications. And this is only, I'd like to say as well, this is only just a partial fraction of the information on there. As you see, it's not 12,000 little nodes. It's just to show and illustrate that actually if you don't use tools to be able to visualize and interrogate the data with some kind of methodology or methods behind it, you get just, as we call it, a hairball effect, and you can't really see anything. You're like, oh, okay, it's interesting, there's connections. But it doesn't really tell you anything, and you can't expect it. So I just want to play you a video, and it is relevant. And what we're going to see when it starts is the growth of the network over time. And this is, so if you were to play the tool when you were to look at your data, and you start seeing, obviously you can pause and stop, I've just cut it so you can see it. You can see the growth of the network. And what we start to see, and what's really interesting to us, is these red dots, I've increased the speed so you can see it, and this is happening from November the 3rd to November the 11th. I'll stop it in a bit, but these red nodes represent the idea starters, the initial seeds that actually spread within the network. And what's interesting to us is a few things. Is the emergence of the network roles, and the predominance and the actual way the players within, or the actors within the network, stayed central throughout the entire protest and before the protest. So one of the things that we noticed was they were, firstly, is many of these, what you typically see is many of these actors within the actual stakeholders within the network were tweeting before November the 11th, and November 9th, and they gained their kind of notoriety before the actual protest occurred, and until even throughout the protest, because of the way they gained their kind of their share of the network before the protest happened, they continued throughout and afterwards. So the actual network emerged and stayed the same throughout the entire process. So. But what's even more interesting is the number, or the actual, these yellowy orange nodes represent people that are drawing different sources of information together. So what we see here is the red and the red, they can be joined by an orange node because they meant that an original source of information and another original source of information was pulled together, and they were shared by that individual user. So they were the kind of initial seeds. And what's interesting in this network is that there are many of these orange nodes bringing original sources of information together very, very quickly. And I'll show you that in a second. So I'll just stop that here, and we can see the kind of growth of the network. And so from that nasty-looking network there, the hairball, to something like this, we can start to interrogate and see different user roles emerged from the actual communication patterns. And from here, we wanted to understand really what the structures were, what the roles were, and what content's being shared. So the initial thing that we did was, I just want to show this, these are the kind of the proportions over time, not over time, sorry, over, if you look at the natural network grow, and you take segments of the network and say at point X, point Y, how many of these roles emerged. And what we see is that actually, at this point is when the number of the orange nodes that you saw, so the number of people bringing pieces of information together, came at the same point of time, or they reached the same level as the number of blue nodes, so the ones that are just sharing it. So what that's actually showing, and the blue line coming down represents the number of original messages being shared. And what that's actually showing is that the number of pieces of information and the number of cross posts coming together are actually becoming reduced down to one. So when an idea starter or when an original piece of information is being shared, not many other people are, it's becoming saturated, not many other people are engaging with it. It means a piece of information is only being shared by one person and stopping, so it's kind of reaching its end. So in terms of the structure of the data, we noticed that in computer science there's a strong, everything somehow ends up being a power law, so that means it comes down and you have lots of people doing nothing and one or two people doing everything. And we see that kind of characteristic within this data. So as I say, the top 10 idea starters that merged actually represented 15% of the entire data collected, so they produced a lot. But there's something interesting in that as well. As I said, less than 3% of the total tweets were made, but they received most of the retweets. So if we're looking at, I've just obfuscated the names here, but each one of these are actually bars. You can't see, but as you can see, one or two users received majority of the retweets, most of them received hardly any. Yeah, so that's a typical thing. But this is the interesting part, is that although you would expect that if you produce a lot of tweets, or you produce a lot of messages, you're going to be receiving many. What we do notice is that these three here, even though they produce hardly anything, they received a high amount of information being spread. And we wanted to, and without being able to see this through the visual graph and the actual inspection of the data, this would not have become clear. So this is just illustrations of how this approach we're taking shows us different perspectives on the data. And if we look at that information, we start to actually see different to how it is being, so the thing that got us to this stage was that there were many reports about how the online information was being reported in different media sources and different media streams, and they were saying that social media was being used for X, Y, and Z, but actually when we interrogated the data, we found a different set of information that was actually emerging from the bottom to be the information cascades. And many of these things, the common kind of element we found was that they shared external links to different sources of blog posts or some kind of report, which were community driven, not led by the kind of mass media like whatever, like The Guardian or BBC. And actually the information that they were sharing were, rather than talking about the protests, we were talking about police kettling or talking about police action or how to avoid certain things and how to not be shot. So the information that we found, because of the methods that we were using, exposed a different type of information, and which was, to us, really, really interesting, because we wanted to see how this method changed the way we understand the data, and clearly it did. So, how long have I got? A few more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, so just wrapping up now, so it's okay. So just to summarise what we did, is trying to explore the network as a whole and take every piece of information we can without reducing it before. And there's lots of, and we're in a kind of discussion now about how do we do sampling, how do we try to understand the concept of sampling when you have very, very large pieces of information, and we're working in the kind of the world where you can't even start to visualize this information and process it, so we're working in that. and try to understand how this information diffuses and allow the content to rise to the top rather than placing a predefined model on top of this. And it's that idea of connecting the micro and macro, and the work that we're trying to do, and we do a lot in Southampton as well, is trying to bring together the online and offline activity and trying to bring together, understand how online action and offline action has some relation between the two. And I suppose the final thing is this idea of, like I just said, we need to, there's a little quote there, Savage. We need to, as I say, we need to actually bridge, and Susan, and I just want to reinforce that, is the computational and social sciences. I mean, in Southampton we do a lot of interdisciplinary work. We're always working across the boundaries and trying to look at each other's methods, and it is challenging and it is exciting at the same time, because we're seeing, as they were saying, ontology, just even the word confused us for about 2 weeks. So really it's a challenge, but it's really useful in terms of how we interrogate the data, and it's both has their weaknesses and their strengths. And in computational sciences, we struggle a lot with taking these models, or these non-computational models, and trying to apply them to what we do and trying to actually understand what they mean for us. And in social sciences, there's this I mean, it's trying to scale up in some sense some of the methods that we use to understand the actual data that's coming in there. So that's everything. Thank you very much, and